Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to another Sankofa event. I'm your host, Michaela Skurlock. I'm the event coordinator for Sankofa Bookstore. If you aren't familiar with us, we're a small Black-owned bookstore located on Georgia Avenue, right across the street from Howard University, specifically the School of Business. We've been around since 1998. We were founded by filmmaking couple Hailey and Shrinkiana Garima, and we are so happy to be a community space that provides books that are by and about people of African descent. Likewise, we like to bring events that are for people like us, that are for the diaspora, for continental African people, for all of us to just come together and learn about each other. Today, we're so happy to have two friends of Sankofa Bookstore. We have Sister Nkechi Taifa and Brother Sam P.K. Collins. You might be familiar with Sam from his events that he's had at Sankofa Bookstore, All Eyes on DC. Maybe you're familiar with his journalistic works in the Washington Informer, or as an educator, maybe he teaches some of your children. Sister Nkechi Taifa, I'm sure you know who she is. She also did a book event with us last year. We can talk about that later as well. Um, Before we get started, I just want to let you all know that there will be a Q&A at the end of the discussion. So please, throughout the conversation, if you have any questions or comments, put them in the chat and I'll make sure they get answered or looked at when it's time. So let me tell you a little bit more about Sam P.K. Collins and Sister Nkechi Taifa. Between 2015 and 2020, DC-based journalist and educator Sam P.K. Collins, known to many as Raspakuya Blue, tell me if I said that right when you come on, okay? He hosted the All Eyes on DC show at We Act Radio in Anacostia and later at Sankofa Video Books and Cafe near Howard University. This community program, often recorded or live streamed before a live audience, represented Collins' growing Pan-African consciousness and desire to use journalism as a means of organizing people of African descent around issues of great importance. Nkechi Taifa, Esquire, is founder, principal, and CEO of the Taifa Group, LLC, a social enterprise firm whose mission is to advance justice. Nkechi was recently appointed to the governing board of the Corrections Information Council, an independent monitoring body that provides oversight over the conditions of district residents imprisoned throughout the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and the DC Department of Corrections. So, like I said, we're here for the book discussion and just overall celebration of Sam's first book, Babylon Be Still: How a Journalist-Educator Adopted an African-Centered Worldview. So, without further ado, I'm going to bring them on. And I just want to note that today is a special day, and I want Sam to talk about why he chose today for this book celebration.
Yes. First, thank you so much for hosting this event. Today marks my 10-year anniversary with the Black Press. As a matter of fact, Monday might, but Easter weekend in general. Easter Monday, April 2012, I covered my first story, which was Easter Monday at the National Zoo. And from that time on, I've just been writing for the Informer, whether it was news articles or opinion pieces. But yes, 10 years in the Black Press this weekend. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to disappear and I'm going to let you all get started with your conversation, okay?
All right. So actually, Sam, before we even go on, not only is April 16th your 10-year anniversary with the Black Press, but it's also DC Emancipation Day.
Yes,
the day in which, well, actually, technically, really, it was the day in which white folks, former slave owners, received reparations for letting us go in DC. That's what it is.
Exactly, yeah.
Holiday in DC. So you are in good stead with respect to your anniversary. So again, congratulations on the publication of your book, Babylon Be Still: How a Journalist-Educator Adopted an African-Centered Worldview. And can you first start off by just letting us know just what inspired the title of this book, Babylon Be Still?
No problem. Garnet Silk, he was a very powerful reggae musician, a Rasta man. He transitioned in the 1980s due to a house fire in which he had to rescue his mother, and he never made it out. But he had a very great voice, great harmonious voice, carried a lot of weight, And one of his songs was Babylon Be Still. Babylon be still while I blow this trumpet. And when you're talking about Babylon, you're talking about a land of confusion, both metaphorically and physically, in which the powers that be put different things in our way to confuse us and take us away from who we are. So in writing this book, I'm telling Babylon to be still while I assert my independence as an African man through journalism and education. And one more point. In the song Babylon Be Still, Garnett Silk references a biblical scripture, John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word is God. So Babylon Be Still is a manifestation of what was deep in my spirit over many, many years, from the times that I was, in the streets with friends, and I gained a consciousness about what it was to be a Black man in America, going through college and seeing who I was and who I wasn't up until this day, and making sense of it in the spirit up until the point that it manifested in the word.
So, Brother Sam, let our Sankofa viewers give us just a brief overview of what the book is about and why you wrote it.
No problem. The book chronicles 10 years of my development as a Pan-Africanist, and I touch on various subjects as it relates to education, political organizing, celebritization, spirituality, and even relationships between elders and young people in the Pan-African community. And I even touch on just things that people who are finding themselves, who are re-Africanizing themselves, need to find out or need to keep in mind. And as you get further and further into the book, you get to see how I developed in my Pan-African consciousness and what obstacles I overcame in doing so. And you also get a sense of my pedigree and my theoretical orientation as it relates to being a journalist. Because once you adopt a certain consciousness, it really changes the way in which you write and in which you teach young people. So the book covers all of that, and it shows how change can happen over what's considered a short span of time.
So you speak of Pan-Africanism, and I know throughout the book, Pan-Africanism is there. Can you just describe for us just how a Pan-African worldview influence how you approach your journalistic and your teaching crafts?
Definitely. Pan-Africanism, by definition, is a Black person's identity with the African continent and the African diaspora. It is a paradigm through which there are no borders, through which we are not tied to the names and labels that colonizer governments give us. So I am not an American. My parents, who were born and raised in Liberia, are not only Liberians, but we all identify under Pan-Africanism as Africans who live in certain regions of the world. So in identifying as a Pan-Africanist, I don't take on certain labels when it comes to the American system. I don't identify as a Democrat or a Republican. I don't even identify as a racial minority, because my paradigm is not exclusive to America. I've taken off the borders, and I look at myself as one out of 1 billion or so African people across the world, which in fact makes me part of a global majority. And in taking on that mindset, it has made me more skeptical of the American government, at various levels, and it has made me better able to identify with the people who I write about in my stories. I address that in a chapter of the book that talks about grassroots journalism, because journalism, by definition, in the American system, is the fourth branch of government. So you have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. They all work together to create balance, and journalists are supposed to shed light on what happens in those systems. But because journalists are often indebted to the Democratic and Republican Party, they cannot be totally honest about what is going on. So as a Pan-Africanist with a class consciousness and a consciousness about who we were and who we continue to be, it is my job to shed light on what is happening and to show our people through my writing our potential as African people. And I also have done so through education as well. And we can talk more about that, but that's pretty much the gist of what Pan-Africanism has done.
Okay, so before we get to education, I know you're I I know your parents were, you were born in Liberia also, am I correct?
Nah, actually, I've never been to Liberia. I was born at Howard University Hospital,
Hey,
October
me too.
21st,
Freedman's Hospital
1989.
before it was Howard University Hospital.
So I'm DC through and through, and coming up, like, so people would often joke when I'm in the house, I'm in Liberia because my family, they came here in the 80s. So there's certain aspects of the culture, even with the Liberian English. It wasn't until I went to Truesdale that I started seeing my worlds clashing, because on one end of the spectrum, I'm too American for my Liberian family, but on the other end of the spectrum, I'm too Liberian for my American colleagues, and my peers. So like even that in itself was a whole like situation to navigate. But nah, I was born and raised here. Haven't been back yet, but I still keep in contact with family members, learning about family history, learning about the origin of my middle name, Ploquia. It's been an awesome ride. And the day when I do touch down, it will be a celebration.
So the reason why I asked that, you would said um, you were talking about American versus African and all, and I know coming up because I came up in the Black nationalists, and we would quote Malcolm all the time. I'm not an American. I'm one of the 22 million Black people who are the victims of Americanism, one of the 22 million Black people who are the victims of democracy, which is nothing more than disguised hypocrisy. And I don't see an American dream. I see an American nightmare. So that was kind of my grounding and how I came up, even though I was born, like you said, Freedman's Hospital, precursor to Howard University Hospital. But I always identified with the Pan-African world, okay? And Garvey had a lot to do with that. And I know you write a lot about Garvey, that Garvey, the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, had a tremendous impact on you. I want to hear a little bit about that. And then I want to go back to Truesdale and kind of bring the journey up. But tell us a little bit about Garvey and this whole Pan-Africanist concept and how that is relevant to Black people here in these times today.
No problem. Between the spring or summertime of 2014 up until the fall of 2015, I was working for a left-wing progressive publication. It's defunct now, but the publication was a part of the Center for American Progress. It was an organization started by the Clintons, I think, way back when. And, I got that job out of college. I thought that I could enter the so-called mainstream and, navigate that. And even then, I had this yearning to write about what was happening. And then, that was during the time Trayvon Martin was gunned down not too long ago. During that time, we were coming up with, Freddie Gray during that time, Sandra Bland, so many brothers and sisters who have been gunned down by, vigilantes or people of the system. And, I had a yearning to write about what was happening. And during that time, I was growing out my locks. But even during that time, just out of anger and out of a yearning to find that connection, I started reading this anthology of Garvey speeches on the 63 bus every morning, back and forth to that job, back and forth to that job. And what Garvey was saying in comparison to what I was hearing were two totally different things, whereas the progressives were talking more about this utopia where we all could exist, come together under an American system that was progressive and we can all achieve the impossible. Garvey was talking about people of African descent standing up and doing for themselves, forging an identity and going back to an African utopia with Africa as the center. And every day I read that. And Garvey had a tone about him in his readings and in his writings where he spoke very confidently and he spoke without any apprehension about who he was and who he wasn't. And that just really spoke to me because in the newsroom is where a lot of terrorism happens in terms of you attempting to pitch stories and people who are not of your skin tone or your ideology trying to inhibit what it is that you can write about. The newsroom as a Black person is a place where if you're not settled in who you are, you will succumb to pressure to write totally different. And the feelings that I felt in that newsroom were no different than what I felt when I worked at National Public Radio and when I worked at NBC Universal during the summer of 2011. Just really thinking about who I was as a Black man and trying to navigate these spaces where I couldn't quite articulate why a story was important, or why I couldn't stand up for myself when a colleague told me, don't write about Harriet Tubman if it's not Black History Month. So I was in spaces. Where I could not express my Afrocentricity, my Blacktricity. But Marcus Messiah Garvey showed me that it was okay to do so, and that as Black people, as African people, we needed to do so in these times especially.
I know that you wrote in your book about the more you read about Marcus Garvey, the more you wore your African clothes, the more you went out to community events, that the more pride in Africa that you had and that you garnered. You mentioned a little bit also in your book about microaggressions, and you just talked about some of the dichotomies in the workplace. Would you talk about microaggressions in the classroom as well as in the workplace? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Describe that, what you would talk.
I want to focus on the classroom first. That's a very good question. Like the classroom, and looking back, once again, grad school, I went to GW as an undergrad and a graduate. As an undergrad, I assumed the leadership positions within the Black community. Even during that time, I had a nationalist mindset, even though I couldn't quite call myself a nationalist. In forming a magazine, I identified as a journalist who was writing for Black people, right? And I assumed leadership positions in the community. I was confident in who I was, but grad school really tore me apart as far as being, not only one of a few Black people, but one of a few Black males in the classroom, and even being young at that, because I went to grad school at the age of 21. So I went to grad school between 21 and 24 with no outside professional experience among people of various races, not Black, but various races, especially white people who had experience with NGOs, nonprofits, government organizations, and they brought that experience into the classroom. So being in the classroom among them, right, with the huge age difference and the outside experience difference really took a toll on me. And I remember one conversation during this sociology course, we were talking about the plight of Black people and what was happening with Black people and gentrification. And then at one point, there was talk about, Black poverty and this and that. And something in my spirit told me to raise my hand and say, well, listen, Black people aren't, people to be looked at as impoverished. We have always done for self throughout history. Even think about the Black Panther breakfast program. That just came out of my soul. In another instance, right, when we were talking about the plight of Black people in this country, I mentioned culture as a reason why Black people are at the bottom of the totem pole. At that time, I couldn't quite articulate why. And the Urugu, who was the teacher at the time, he tried to, in his liberal ways,
Can you explain what Urugu is for
white people, Europeans whose Asili, whose soul is imbalanced, and because it is so, they wreak havoc on the world in terms of just turning paradigms upside down and taking us away from our natural order. So the European, in response to my answer to the question about our plight, when I told the class that culture was the reason why we are in the situation that we are right now, this Urugu, in his liberal ways, tried to keep me against speaking on that, because remember, in liberalism, right, you can't quite speak on Black pathology, because they assume that when you speak on Black pathology, that you're a conservative, that you're a white settler conservative. But at the time, even though I couldn't quite articulate why I was talking about culture, I knew deep down in my soul, in my subconsciousness, that Black people were taken out of their element. And that was part of the reason, beyond politics, beyond identification, that Black people were in the situation that they are right now. And these are just examples of what was happening to me in the classroom when people tried to stifle my creativity, my self-expression, so forth and so on.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seemed like the more they tried to do that, the stronger it came out in you.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you talked about the classroom. What about in the workplace?
Oh, the workplace, man. I remember one article I tried to write. I fought for that article, man. There was a study that came out in 2015 about diets, so they did a study. They had a South African diet, and then they had the American diet with fats and sugars, and they tested two groups of Africans within that, and they saw that the Africans who had the South African food that was more natural and came from the earth, they had lower blood pressure and things like that. And I used that study to write this article. But mind you, the article was #1 on the site and top 10 on the site for a year and a half, bringing them in lots of revenue. But for me to write that article in the first place, I had to go through a metaphysical mental boxing match with them. I had to explain to them as a health reporter why it was important for me to write about this study, what this study meant in terms of the public health implications for Black people in America and what it meant for us in terms of our identity, what we identified with. And they didn't quite get that at first. That was just one example. Another example, statisticians and scientists, they know this very well, right? Studies come across my desk all the time as a health reporter, okay? This is what I was back at the time, writing for the progressives. And this study came across my desk, right, that linked poverty to lower IQs, right? So I opened up the study, but the sample size is 100 people across 9 states. Mm-hmm. How do you come to that conclusion testing 100 people across 9 states? And they wanted me to write about that, to use that article, to use that study to write an article. I put my foot down so fast. I had to, because it's like, I'm not gonna use that study to pathologize my own people. And come to find out, the Washington Post took the same study a week later and wrote something about it. But I had avoided that because, once again, I came from a mindset where, as a journalist, I have an opportunity to write for and about my people and about what's going on. And when you're looking at information, first of all, there's information in how it's collected, how it's interpreted, and how people write about it. So as a journalist, if you're not within yourself having that foundation and you're not able to question things and you're always thinking about what they're going to say, then you're going to fall victim to their ways. And because by that time I was going through this consciousness, I was always skeptical about what was coming across my desk. And I always felt the need to even challenge anything that came. And it came to a point where they respected it. But at first, there were always questions.
So you talk about this growing Pan-Africanist consciousness that you have and that you've been developing. You write about that in your book. I'm just curious, say you didn't have that consciousness, how would a lack of a Pan-Africanist consciousness limit a Black person's potential to excel in their craft? In your case, journalism, but it could be in any craft, law or medicine or the like. So what does not having such a consciousness, what would that serve to do to people?
Very, very great question. Very great question. And once again, that speaks to how Pan-African consciousness is the foundation of any career that you're going to take on. Martin Delany called us a nation within a nation. So he is the precursor, as we know, to Marcus Messiah Garvey. So during the late 19th century, he called us a nation within the nation. Without a Pan-African consciousness, you don't have a nation building mentality. Without a nation building mentality, you are writing things and you are conducting in your profession as an agent of the American government rather than as an agent for African people here and abroad. So, for example, if I'm a lawyer or if I'm a carpenter, I'm building houses, with the intent of, of course, making money, but not with the intent of, doing for my people, right? Or if I'm a lawyer, I might represent certain interests that go against what my people need or like what they stand for. In the realm of journalism, without that Pan-African consciousness, I'm taking on ideologies and I'm writing for and about people who want to maintain the American empire. I don't bring to the craft that skepticism around what the American empire has done and what it continues to do. So to keep it short, a Pan-African consciousness gives me a lens through which I write stories with the intent of showing my people their potential and giving them a chance to see what it is that we can do outside of the American system that has kept us in shackles and continues to do so. Because without a Pan-African consciousness, there's only an assumption that there are two political parties. And oftentimes as Black people, right, we often look to the Democratic Party when in fact, the Democratic and Republican Party are two wings on the same bird. As a matter of fact, in this country, to become president, to become a Supreme Court justice, whatever the case may be, you have to take on ideologies that are moderate. And modernism, not modernism, but moderation has been of great detriment to African people. When you study the history of the United States, you see that it's only 200 years old or so, maybe 300 years going on, right? But when you become a Pan-Africanist, you understand that our presence in the world, in the universe, goes well beyond 200 years. It's thousands of years. So who am I to confine my identity, my people's history, our culture to 200 or 300 years? Because in doing so, you will take anything as progress when in fact it is not. That is how we have to operate as Pan-Africanists. And then when you take that to any profession and you have a nation building mindset, you apply your craft into doing for self. So instead of working for somebody else, you might become more entrepreneurial, or you might adopt, economic systems that are building families instead of building for somebody else. All of that comes into play when you have a Pan-African mindset.
So thank you so very much for that, my brother Sam. As you probably know, I wrote a memoir, Black Power, Black Lawyer, My Audacious Quest for Justice. And it basically is a story of a young girl growing up during the Black Power era and the socially conscious lawyer that she becomes. And I had just a myriad of life events that shaped my consciousness and shaped the things that I shared in my book. As for you, tell us about some of the life events that shaped or inspired everything that you wrote in your book, Babylon Be Still.
No problem. Where do I start? Let's go back to Truesdale Elementary. Truesdale Elementary, being called African Booty Scratcher and trying to navigate that. Growing up on Kennedy Street, being called that as well and trying to navigate life. 2002, 20 years ago in October, meeting my older brother for the first time. My older brother, he is about 6 years older than me. My mother's first son. He grew up in Liberia. So he came here in 2002, and just having somebody who was around my age and learning that, Africans on the continent and Africans in the States aren't different at all. We just go through the same things. That opened my eyes, going to Little White Chapel by the Wayside, a church founded by Liberians that's in Montgomery County, Maryland, and learning about Liberian history there and being immersed in Liberian culture, that shaped my consciousness. And I would even also say, hopping off the porch at the age of 13, 14, traveling between Kennedy Street and Tacoma Park, Maryland, because at Tacoma Park, it's a little more diverse ethnically. So you get to meet up with Haitians, Jamaicans, Afro-Latinos, growing up in that system and seeing that, regardless of where you live, you're still encountering the same problems and same paradigms as far as police brutality is concerned, drug use, things of that nature. All of that really influenced what I want to do at GW as far as being a journalist. And I would even say coming up in journalism, founding a magazine, interning at different mainstream publications and learning about who I wasn't and who I was. And I can even take you to 2013, meeting my fiance now, my fiance, Taisha L. Jones, fourth generation Washingtonian, her family, African people, been here for centuries, her African identity. You understand? Like that was the final piece of the puzzle. That was the final piece of the puzzle. Like I can't speak on that enough because of the fact that, with her and her feminine energy, just questioning and challenging everything as far as the American paradigm, she keeps a young man on his toes, and just really understanding like Pan-Africanism, beyond politics, when we're talking about culturally, We're talking about rites of passage. We're talking about education, things of that nature. You know, I would think that she's been a very pivotal force in who I've become. I remember one conversation, as a matter of fact, when MSNBC published one of my works that I did, you know, or not published it, but they might have mentioned it. And then, you know, I was real excited. And then she asked me, well, like, what's your goal of doing all of this? It was a very loaded question, a short question, but a very loaded question indeed, you know, and, you know, just having her by my side, it really speaks to, you know, how, well, first of all, we are all similar in our Africanism, you know, because they like calling it African-American vernacular English. It's a whole language in its own, just like how in Liberia, we got our own English. So, and even with the food, the familiar structures, the way, you know, we call people Miss and Mrs. here. In Liberia, we call them uncle, auntie, right? There are a lot of similarities more than differences. And Taisha was able to bridge that gap for me. You know, I told her, you know, like, and this is the last thing I said, dang, like, you're the first, you know, Washingtonian Black woman who's called herself an African. And that just turned me on. I ain't gonna hold you. Like, it's just like, I was like, okay, she's the one. So, you know, that was a culminating event in terms of just taking things a step further. But before all of that, it was about reconciling differences and coming to terms with who I am and who I wasn't.
Wow. And you just had me smiling talking about your fiance. And that's great, because it's that consciousness that attracts like minds together. And that is what happened with you. I'm going to ask you a couple of other more questions. But before I do, I want you to be thinking about an excerpt to read from the book. So be thinking about that as I, you know, as we go on. So, your book is chock full of information, chock full of stories, and you know, things that moved and grooved you, and that helped to shape you into the person that you are today. Question: given the political and social climate, how would you say this book is relevant and helpful to African people living in the United States today?
I think African people in the United States, we lack imagination in what we can do for ourselves. And I think that every time we find ourselves bursting to get out that bubble, the American system finds its way to bring us back in through corporatism, corporate sponsorship, through representation in government, and other little jewels that are of no significance to a people who built this country and who represent the greatest race in all of the world, the first race in all of the world. We lack imagination in the sense that we don't see ourselves as anything beyond Americans. We are not African Americans. We are Africans in America. We are new Africans, as a matter of fact. We got to identify as such. We are a nation that is connected to Africans all across the world, with Africa as our home. So this book does nothing but to help us identify as such, and to encourage us to, once we take on that identity, to act in that identity. Because America is very good at corporatizing movements and watering them down, so that by the end of the day, it meets the interest of the very few at the top. They put people in front of us who they say speak for us, but at the very same time are neutralizing us, you know? And the book really speaks about that at length. And it speaks about efforts by liberals, you know, Black liberals. I will go in on the Black liberal class from here until the sun sets, you know. And I mean, you know, I say it out of love, and I say it because within the Black liberal class, you know, is the most talented of our people. You know, people who have gone to college, people who have, you know, a lot of skill sets and a lot of money, you know, a lot of income coming in. But at the very same time, they want to sit at a table that has our blood on it, a table in which we are still 3/5 of a person. Until the American Constitution gets ripped up and they write a new one, you are still 3/5 of a person. Anytime they write you in an amendment and not the original Constitution, you are not a citizen of this country. So You have to keep that in mind in the way that you operate. And you have to keep in mind that even when they bring in people, your Cory Bookers, your Justice Jackson Browns, whoever, when they bring them in, there are still class schisms. There are still class schisms, because I myself, I fell into that trap going to GW, thinking that, you know, because my mother was a housekeeper, I can identify with other housekeepers at GW and things like that. And of course I did, but at the very same time, had I not found that consciousness, I would be working in the same system that was holding them down and creating schisms. So we got to get out of this mentality that because one of us makes it, that all of us have made it. Because once again, you cannot rise to the top of the American structure without taking off heads and then some. President Barack Obama put his hands on that bomb that took down Gaddafi, okay? He was part of NATO, okay? Everything that's going on in Russia and Ukraine is a part of NATO right now. And NATO is the same force that has AFRICOM on the continent, military bases all over Africa. Even this whole Back to Africa movement that we did with Ghana back in 2019 or so, they're co-opting it by bringing your favorite celebrities on to talk about going back to Africa. But what are they going back to Africa to do? They're not going back to Africa to reunite with the continentals there. They're going there to build more corporations to keep us divided. So we got to understand the difference between celebritization and real Pan-Africanism. Real Pan-African nationalism, where we're not depending on them, but we're depending on us, and we're taking on old customs, attitudes, and traditions. That's what the book is about. And I will stand on that until the day I transition. And even in the ancestral realm, I will keep talking about that.
Wow. Sam P.K. Collins, author of Babylon Be Still, How a Journalist-Educator Adopted an African-Centered Worldview. He is passionate. He is a brother after my own heart, because I'm a passionate person too. But tell us about this P.K., this middle name, Sam P.K. Collins. Does that have something to do with this passion? Or tell us about that story.
PK is Ploquia. It was the middle name I was embarrassed of coming up. So Ploquia, the meaning I'm not quite sure of yet. I'm still finding out, but it was my great-grandfather's name. My great-grandfather, Peter Ploquia Seaton, on my father's side. So my grandmother, she just transitioned back in 2017. Her father, he was a sailor, and he often traveled between Liberia and the Ivory Coast. As a matter of fact, I was told that my father, his grandson, was one of his favorite grandchildren. So that really shows the reason why I got the Ploquia as my middle name when I was born. As a matter of fact, when I look at my great-grandfather's pictures, he and my father share very similar physical similarities. So the Seaton name, from my understanding, came out of, I think, New Jersey. And as you understand, Liberia is a country that was founded by freed Africans who were on this side who pretty much repatriated to Africa. So my understanding is that way back when, some of my people were there, but I also have people who are indigenous to Liberia throughout the Gribbo and the Bassa tribe. Ploquia is a Gribbo name. It's a name that comes out of Maryland County in Liberia. Maryland, the name, now I don't know why they call it Maryland, but as I say, Liberia has an American, colonization type of situation thing going on. But at the very same time, Ploquia is a continuation of my Gribbo legacy on my father's side. And that's a name that I carry on. People know me as Ploquia. They knew me that back in college. They know me that at Nation House, wherever I am. And that's just my great-grandfather out of Maryland County, Cape Palmas, Rocktown to be specific, right there on the coastal line of Liberia. One of the first people that the repatriates came across. And my understanding is that half of the Gribbo tribe and the Crew people were actually fighting against enslavement at one point, So we got a lot of people who are speaking this and that on the internet about Africans enslaving other Africans, and to a degree that was true, but at the very same time, the whole picture is that there were Africans fighting enslavement as well. And that just goes to speak to my name, Ploquia. And the last name is Glibuo. Global, that is a Gribble name as well. My understanding in talking to my auntie, my grandmother's younger sister, Auntie Rose, that was our surname before we took on Collins. And in Liberia, you can either take on a European last name through a couple of ways, either through missionaries or by way of being an indigenous person who goes to an Americo-Liberian's house and works for them and takes on their last name to go up in society. So even in Liberia, you know, there was a lot of schisms going on there. And Liberia, you know, in my opinion, has the potential to become a bastion of Pan-Africanism if we break off the chains of American acceptance, you know, because even though it wasn't colonized, America still used Liberia as a satellite nation to carry out its deeds, you know, throughout the world wars. You got Firestone, so forth and so on. But Ploquia, that's my Gribbo name. I'm a Gribbo man, a Bassa man. Shout out to Cape Palmas. Shout out to West Point, Liberia. That's my mother's hood. You know, Vice magazine, they did us dirty. They try to call it the slum, but West Point got some of the hardest working people out of Liberia. You can't put that on that. You can't put that on anything. You can't.
So let me ask you this then, Quia, okay. How has your Liberian heritage been pivotal in the shaping of your Pan-African consciousness?
Very good question. All right, let me paint a picture for you. Sam, you got a hard face. Are you African? Yeah, my folks are from Liberia. But if you're African, then why is your last name Collins? Well, here's the story. Liberia was founded by the American Colonization Society. They, you know, after the Haitian Revolution and, you know, the various slave rebellions that took place, right? They did not want this contingent of freed blacks in the country to inspire other black people to get free. So they shipped them off to Africa, right? And that's how Liberia got founded. And that's how so many of us in the country have taken on European surnames. So if it's not Collins, it's Johnson, various last names. It runs the gamut. But that situation throughout elementary and throughout middle school, in explaining that, is how I was growing in my Pan-African consciousness, and how, you know, talking to people, I made the argument that even though my parents were born and raised here and your parents were born and raised there, we are all Africans.
And we are all Africans.
Definitely. And to take it a step further, you know, I forgive them, but we have Africans of various nationalities who often try to play Liberia like it's not authentically African. Because I remember coming up in college and speaking with Nigerians and you know, Zimbabweans. Once again, I'm not making a blanket assumption, but these are my experiences in speaking with them and in espousing my Liberian heritage. They would often say, well, Liberia, that's not really an African country. You guys have American last names, this, that, and the third. But hold on, Slim, y'all colonized too. Your borders were not drawn by your people as well. The Berlin Conference did y'all dirty as well. So how can you call us colonized when you guys still got governments where they're teaching French and German in the school system? And you go to their court system, they're still wearing blonde wigs. So come on now, what's going on? You know, and these are situations that I went through throughout my adolescence and throughout my adulthood.
So I think we're time to hear an excerpt from your book. I mean, I know that this is a compilation of think pieces that you wrote between 2011 and 2020. And I know as I read through the book, I got a sense of your spiritual and professional transformation from being a young college graduate, struggling to express yourself in the so-called mainstream media space, all the way through to the end of the book, where you find your grounding as a grassroots journalist and an educator who's dedicated unabashedly telling authentic and holistic stories about the African experiences seen through your eyes. So what are you going to share with the Sankofa audience right now?
Very good question. Yeah, we're taking them to church this weekend.
All right.
Taking them to church this weekend. All right, shout out to President Obama. And I'm picking this part right here because when I was, so mind you, I went to GW. Obama won the election in 08. Mind you, I was working in the gym that night, but a lot of my friends ran down to the White House. So GW's right here. The White House is about 5 blocks away. The whole campus ran to the White House and they celebrated. All right. Obama was the ushering of a new beginning, they said. Brothers who had dreadlocks or locks down to their butt were cutting their locks. Various clubs throughout the city, the dress code got even tighter. You couldn't wear shoes anymore. You had to wear ties and suits and stuff, all because Obama came into town and it was black excellence, right? But at the very same time, we were still getting bamboozled, right? In every step of the way. Okay. And this book right here explains it. All right, this is a subsection of a chapter that's titled Where Obama Era Black Millennials Went Wrong. Even with the political and economic gains in the decades after the civil rights era, remnants of the US's racial past exist in all facets of society via the prison industrial complex, spatial mismatching in urban cities, food deserts, inequities in the healthcare, and other hurdles Black people face. Until the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012 and the acquittal of his killer, many people of African descent refused to acknowledge that hard reality. Instead, many Black people, especially those of us in the educated class who felt compelled to follow the Barack Obama playbook in navigating mainstream professional circles, chose to believe that the attainment of political power and clout in a post-racial Babylon system could get us a seat at the table for which our ancestors valiantly fought and shed blood. All the while, the nation's first Black president faced heavily conspicuous racial opposition from the Tea Party Republicans and of the majority white factions, even as he took on moderate positions that had a negative impact on middle and low income people of African descent. As the years went on, the hope that Obama sold us vanished. We saw him ignore Black people while openly addressing issues of importance to the LGBTQ, Hispanic, and Muslim communities poignantly and with confidence. When it came to addressing the state-sanctioned assault on Black bodies, however, he couldn't even bring himself to say Black Lives Matter during his last State of the Union address. After cutting Pell Grant funds, often used for matriculation to HBCUs, Obama chastised school administrators for mismanagement of funds and low graduation rates. Even My Brother's Keeper, Obama's hallmark program designed to uplift young Black men, has faced criticism for not allocating funds to grassroots organizations and ignoring pressing indicators of delinquency and a life in and out of prison. In recent years, Obama has increasingly focused on incarcerated people, announcing the release of thousands of prisoners serving long sentences for low-level drug offenses. Such overtures, however, do little to reverse the effects of draconian drug laws, overzealous policing in majority Black inner-city communities, or reversing mass incarceration that has enmeshed Black and brown men, women, and children.
Wow. So was that one of the pieces that was published in the Washington Informer? I know you have a long history with the Informer, but just curious, how do your authentic pieces such as that, your very passionate pieces, how are they accepted in either the mainstream media or in the progressive, Black cultural, shall we say, media?
No problem. That piece wasn't published in the Informer. Another piece I wrote during the pandemic, the Informer published. That piece spoke to questions that the 2020 graduate had to answer. And in that piece, I spoke about how the school system at large had not prepared young people for an advancing technological society, and how the school system, in taking tax dollars, actually coddled young people and did not give them anything that they could use to navigate a world that was breaking down. That was one piece that the Informer published in April of 2020, around 2 years ago. But in terms of my reporting, I'm very happy to say that the Informer has been very respectful of my perspective, and I, and I would like to say that I bring quite a bit of balance into the equation. Just being a millennial and being somebody with political and social leanings that can take the paper a step further. One thing that I know I've gotten a lot of positive feedback on is my penchant for interviewing real people. So in the book, I speak about grassroots journalism, and the editor at the Informer who I came across, Denise W. Barnes, not the publisher Denise Rolock Barnes, but Denise W. Barnes. She always advised me against talking exclusively to politicians, because she said old school journalism, if you wanted to really get the lowdown on what was happening, you had to talk with real people, mamas and babas, children, with their parents' permission, of course, but real people going through real things. So an aspect of my journalism is being able to track down real people, paint a picture of what's going on with them, and use their story and paint that in the context of the bigger issue that's going on. And that's pretty much how I've been able to flourish at the Informer, because the Informer, unlike other newsrooms, they have given me an opportunity to grow in my Afrocentricity, and they often welcome that perspective because, and the thing that, and like understandably so, to a degree it's understandable, but it's not. People, they often vilify African scholars, or they try to, in the YouTube generation, they try to write us off as ill-informed and as, people who don't have their facts together. We're too aspirational. But one thing I can say about me as a journalist is that anything that I say is well researched, because research comes from the development of a thesis. And the development of a thesis comes from understanding your value system, your core values, who you are as a person, what it is that you aspire to do. So in understanding my core values, I always bring to the table new, fresh stories that prioritize everyday people, first of all, and second of all, take politicians to task, because you have to have you have to have a healthy skepticism, and I think that the Informer has really come to respect that.
I love the Informer. I love Denise Rolock Barnes. We went to junior high school together. We went to Howard University together. We took classes together. She's a lawyer also, like I'm a lawyer. And so you had fertile ground to grow and develop there. And when I was first reading your book about Denise Barnes, I thought you were talking about the Denise Rolock Barnes, but it was another Denise Barnes. I don't know how that ended up at the Informer. And that was confusing to me. So you educated me to that. But I understand that that was one of your strong mentors. And, another aspect of the way in which you've been able to express yourself has been through a radio show that you produce, co-host, All Eyes on DC, out of We Act Radio. Can you tell us a little bit about All Eyes on DC?
Yeah, definitely. All Eyes on DC initially came out of my experiences at GW. GW is a city within a city. So GW attracts, well, first of all, I got to GW on a full ride back in 2007 through the Trachtenberg Scholarship. It's a scholarship for DC students, whether they're public school students, charter school students, whatever the case is, and they get to go to GW for free. So I went there. My understanding is that we're about 6% of the population, DC residents, and GW often attracts students from border schools in Boston, Georgia, New York City, so forth and so on. So coming into GW, I got a bit of a culture shock because of the fact that GW and Foggy Bottom with Georgetown right there and a lot of the office buildings in Ward 2, and such, it's a far cry away from uptown DC. And I was coming to GW at a time when DC was really gentrifying, so in GW, as the largest landowner in DC, signifies that schism that I felt. Yeah, that's my understanding. They own a bunch of downtown DC. So, All Eyes on DC, initially coming out of undergrad and going to grad school, was my effort to bridge the gap between, the Washington that tourists knew and the DC that we know. That was initially my, goal with All Eyes on DC. But that was back in 2012, before I grew into my Pan-African consciousness. Because by 2015, I had been reading Garvey. I had, been, understanding more deeply Malcolm's growing Pan-Africanism and how that led to his assassination. I had been taking part in different events. By 2015, I turned all eyes on DC more into a Pan-African foundational platform. And We Act Radio has been very gracious in letting me host events there. I hosted events there throughout 2015. Over the first few months of 2015, by late 2015, we moved to Sankofa, which was more amenable to the type of vibe I was trying to get, because we had, books there. It was well known as a hub for scholarship. And ever since then, from 2016 to 2020, we had events there. And all eyes on DC. The understanding was that DC is the epicenter of the global Babylon system. So Babylon, biblically speaking, metaphorically and metaphysically speaking, is a paradigm of great confusion. Right? Hold on one second. Yeah, that's the dog. He's talking about Babylon. You gotta forgive him. Every time I say Babylon, he goes crazy. He doesn't like Babylon either. So with DC being the epicenter of the Babylon system, I really wanted to highlight how DC being the center of government still had this Pan-African energy. And I used it as a platform for many Pan-Africanists, Black nationalists, Black leftists to really speak about their craft and what they do. And we used the interview as an opportunity for them to speak about the issues of the day. And we did it in a grassroots style where, instead of a platform like Meet the Press that was very sterile, we were speaking in front of an audience. People got to enjoy their coffee, their tea, their sandwiches, things of that nature, while they listened to music and they heard good interviews. And, we opened it up with I Go, I May, and just, different things that are characteristic of an African-centered space. So it was my opportunity to re-Africanize news telling and to turn it more into a griot tradition.
Wow. So I have one last question for you before we bring back on Michaela, who will field any Q&A that there is. The question is, I'm just curious now. I'm going to ask it with the knowledge that, to me, you're a young person, but what can young people take away from your book? So I guess we're talking about your peers, the millennials. What is it that you feel not only they can take away, but also folk like me from the baby boomer generation? What can the general public at large at those two, extremes, I guess we could say, take away from your book?
No doubt, no doubt. First of all, to my peers in the millennial generation, some of y'all, I forgive y'all for calling me a hotep derogatorily. I forgive y'all with all sincerity, and I'm just going to say that 2020 with George Floyd's murder, it showed a lot of people what the game really was, although I really can't understand why that's the case. But at the very same time, and humbly speaking, I believe and I know for sure that millennials, given the fact that we're coming up in our mid 30s and our 40s, we are in a very powerful position to, take on seats of power, to build industries, to dominate industries, whatever the spirit moves y'all to do as millennials. My only hope and ask is that in doing so, we change paradigms. We do so with a Pan-African consciousness, that we identify as Africans. This burgeoning anything but Africa movement has to stop. We have to stop denying Africa in everything that we do. We have to look at the worldview through a Pan-African lens, and we have to stop being ethnocentric, because the world is not just the United States. There's a whole lot going on beyond the United States. Long before Russia went at Ukraine, Yemen was getting bombed. Somalia was going through it. I know Mali just went at France, as far as taking out the colonial remnants of that government. So all over the African world, I know in Colombia, we talk even Cuba, the Afro-Cubans down there are going through it. When you're talking about the Dominican Republic and Haiti, how Haitians are getting, pretty much pummeled. There's a lot going on, and as millennials, we are in the position to use our know-how to advance a very powerful cause. And for the baby boomers, we need y'all. We need y'all to understand us, and we need y'all to continue to impart words of wisdom. The World War II generation is slowly but surely entering the ancestral realm, and we need more conversations like this that are intergenerational, where we're learning from one another and we come to a common understanding about what has happened and what needs to happen, because things are not getting passed down, and we are always starting from scratch, and that cannot continue to happen. The Urugu and other groups of people never start from scratch. They keep things going, and going, whereas we are always starting from scratch, and that keeps us behind in the grand scheme of things. Mind you, I don't like saying that we're behind, but what I will say is that we cannot afford to have schisms, and we cannot afford to be separate as elders and young people. And we also need to bring in Generation Z, the young people, the teenagers, the early 20s, the babies, because they have minds and they come from the ancestral realm, and they have a way about thinking of the world that can free us, but only if we embrace them.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Sam, I just love all of your comments. I just love all of your enthusiasm and passion about Pan-Africanism, which is what we all need to be about. And I want to see if Michaela can join us now from Sankofa, that safe space that you talk about, that liberated zone, shall we say, where we can come in and do the things we need to be doing about the necessary tasks of nation building. So, Michaela, I don't know if you want to see if there are any Q&A for Sam P.K. Collins and his book.
Before I do that, let me just give a round of applause. Like you said, that was very passionate. I enjoyed that so much, and I can see that the people watching enjoyed it just as much as I did. We don't have any questions, but we have a lot of congratulations, and I do want to read that because this is a celebration. So let me read everyone who is giving you those congratulations. So we got from Adam Lang, congrats, Sam. We have from Taisha Jones. We have, yes, Sam, congrats and blessings. And Level Ken, fellow Liberian here, congrats. Susan Lang, congratulations, Sam. Ivy Lewis, congratulations, Professor Collins. So happy for you and excited for where your knowledge is going and those you're reaching. Visions Talents, congratulations. Stacy Palmer, yes. Ivy Lewis, 2 snaps. Preach, Professor Collins. Far too many in areas of influence lack the Pan-Africanist point of view mindset. Stacy Palmer, I love it. Lois Cooper, amen. Adam Lane, preach. Papa Smurf, great interview, Brother Sam. Congratulations on the book. Thank you for taking the time out to discuss schisms, representation of our people, and the issues that plague our self-sufficiency. And then he says, if you haven't gotten that book, grab that. And let me echo that. If you haven't gotten that book, grab it. Sam came into the store last week and he signed several copies. So there might be a few left. If you purchase right now, you might get the signed copy, and hopefully we can get them back in the store to sign some more. So yes, if you haven't gotten your book, you can come into our brick and mortar, or you can go online at www.sankofa.com and get it, and it'll be delivered right to your front steps. So we have Erica Doe. Tell it, brother. So proud of you. Blessings. Snap, snap, snap. So much authenticity and bravery in those words. And then Level put a 100, that stamp that the young kids are using nowadays. So that was the end of it. I don't want to press anyone to ask questions. I think everyone is really full with the information that you gave us. And I will leave you with the last word.
Purchase the book, man. Make sure a young person gets it. Please. Young people, they need this. Every day I'm talking to young people, and I get enthusiastic about what potential they have, so much so that I got to hold myself back sometimes from feeding them too much at once. But if they're inculcated within the knowledge from a very young age in the culture, then we have nothing to worry about. That's the thing. We got to build a whole new world. Please do not let representation and don't let the crumbs that they are giving us take us away from the end goal in mind. Pan-African self-determination and nationalism. Nationalism is not a bad word at all. Nationalism speaks about the need for a nation with customs, attitudes, traditions, and a whole new paradigm. And you do need land to be a nation. Yes, you do. And we are everywhere, but we need organization. It starts at the family, it starts in the community, and most especially, it starts with you. And I'll leave y'all with that. Thank you so much. Shout out to Sankofa. Shout out to these powerful sisters for this platform and just for the questions and the dialogue today. Y'all made my weekend. I really appreciate y'all. Give thanks.
Thank you so much. And before you go, can you please tell people where we can find you, find your writing, your social media?
Yes, yes. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Sam PK Collins, SAMPKCOLLINS. Um, as far as my writings on the Informer, please, I'm on the Informer website as well. So you type in Sam PK Collins, Washington Informer. I'm there. I'm heavily covering education issues in DC. So if you read it, you see authentic voices in there, and speaking about what happens in the public school system. So please check it out and continue to support the Informer.
All right. Thank you so much, Sister Nkechi, Sam PK Collins. This has been amazing. On behalf of Sankofa, we thank you, and we also thank the audience out there. We hope everyone has a great weekend. Stay safe, and don't forget to get the book. Peace, everyone.
Thank you. Peace and blessings.